Hey, Larken Rose here. Got another thought experiment for you. This one isn't about Israel and Palestine. This is a two-part thought experiment, and it'll be probably mildly uncomfortable for voluntarists. But the second part is going to be rather less comfortable for most people who aren't voluntarists. Now, if you don't know what the word voluntarist means, that's fine. Just go through the thought experiment and see what you think. See what you would do. The scenario is this. You are flown back in time in a time machine. Never mind, the time machines don't even work conceptually. And it always annoys me when movies pretend that they actually can. Ignoring all that, you are thrown back in time, and it is your job to be the judge in a case where two people are on trial. One is somebody who ran a slave plantation, and he acted like he owned a bunch of people, and he treated them like property, and he hired other people to whip them if they didn't obey, and he got forced labor out of them and enslaved them, because that happened a lot. So he's now on trial outside of that time and space, and it's your place to judge how wrong he was for that and what should be done to him. But there's a second person on trial at the same time, and that's his wife. She never had any involvement in the slaves. She sat and watched it happen, but she never bossed them around. She never ordered them to be whipped. She was there, and she benefited from the evil institution of slavery, but she didn't directly participate in that. So it's your job as judge. I'm just going to change the scenario in the middle. Instead of you going back in time, they were brought forward. They were like cryo-frozen or something for a couple hundred years and then thawed out, and now you're the judge. So we're not in the setting where society still thinks to a large degree that slavery is somehow legitimate and necessary or unavoidable or any of that. We're in modern days, and you're a person living in modern days who, I hope, recognizes that slavery is really frickin' evil. So it's your job as judge to decide how culpable are these people. The actual slave master who directly oversaw and ordered people around, and then his wife who just sort of watched. She had no direct involvement. She was obviously a beneficiary. And so he's on trial there, and you're the judge. And he's saying, now that we're in modern times, he's saying, well, this was, all sorts of people were doing it. And that was just societally accepted back then. You can't judge me for what I did back then based on the morals of society now. That was like, well, not everyone. Slaves weren't too fond of it. But lots of people back then thought that slavery was a legitimate institution and thought that slaves were legitimate property, the property of their owners. And they thought that's, oh, well, you can't blame me. I'm just one of a bunch of people who did that. And I was just going along with the norms and the law. The law said I was allowed to own people. And how could you possibly put me on trial for something that was legal and to a large degree socially accepted? And now you think you're in a place to judge me for having done that? So the question is, you as judge here and now, what would you say? Would you say, oh, in that case, never mind. You can go because, that's what lots of people thought. And it was legal, so that's fine. If it was up to you, would that be the outcome? Just let him go. Like, he thought it was legitimate, and it was totally legal at the time, and lots of other people were doing it, so that's okay. Would that be your judgment? Now, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm guessing a lot of people, even taking into account that, like, well, people's viewpoints back then were different, would still be, yeah, but they were stinking wrong. Like, the fact that lots of other people were doing something horribly wrong didn't make it less horribly wrong. It just made it a common evil instead of an uncommon evil. It's still totally wrong. He's still a horrible person for having done that. Now, I won't bother to get into the, like, what exact punishment would you inflict on him? Because that's sort of a different thing. But do you agree that he did something really bad and it's not okay to just say, well, lots of people were doing it and it was legal? Okay. Now, you either say, yeah, we're really freaking bad to do that, or no, that's okay. You were, everybody was doing it, or lots of people were doing it. And society kind of accepted it and it was legal, so whatever. Or you can say, yeah, you were a horrible person. Now you come to the wife and she pleads with you, the judge, and says, but I didn't even do any of it. I was there. Like, you can say maybe I should have spoken out against it, or I don't know what, tried to do something about, tried to talk him out of it, or tried to sabotage it, or secretly free the slaves or something. But punishing me for not doing something, that's not fair. And I didn't actually do anything. I didn't boss them around. I didn't whip them. I didn't tell anybody else to whip them. Yeah, I benefited from the institution of slavery, but I was just kind of there as a spectator. You can't blame me for things that I didn't do. So that's her argument. Do you, here and now, as judge, accept that? Do you think that makes it okay? Or that at least she didn't directly do anything herself, so maybe not deserving of punishment, or maybe deserving of less punishment? Do you think she's at least less culpable than the guy who actually oversaw the whipping and treating people like property? Or does she kind of count as a accomplice because, well, you were there and you benefited from it and you didn't do anything to stop it? So you can decide, and I'm not even going to try to talk you into one decision or another. So that's the first half of the thought experiment. How would you judge those two people? One just benefited from it. The other directly participated in the use of aggression to treat other human beings like property. From our comfort and our modern viewpoint now, how would you judge each of them? Now we move to the second part of the thought experiment. This will be different if you're a voluntarist than if you're a statist. Now you're the one who gets cryo-frozen and you wake up in 100 years. And you find yourself on trial. And you're not sure why. They bring you out and you go, well, what's going on? And they say, wasn't it true that you supported a regime that you knew was demanding money from your neighbors and using that money to engage in imperialist warmongering, which included slaughtering many, many thousands of innocent people? You voted for that, right? You were an advocate of that. You waved the flag of the ruling class doing that. You voted for the people in power who gave the orders to have that happen. So, as the defendant here, what do you have to say for yourself? Well, what would you have to say for yourself? Well, I mean, everybody was voting. That's the system we had. And the other choice, I think, was even worse. But I wasn't actually the one taxing anybody. I just voted. I wasn't in the military overseas shooting anybody, either justifiably or unjustifiably. I wasn't directly involved. I just voted for it. I just supported this or that candidate or party, whichever one I thought would do a better job. Would that be your argument? And if so, the judge says to you, that's not really good enough. You supported with your words and your actions and your money and your votes. You supported something that killed thousands of innocent people. That was you. You voted for the people who had been doing that a long time. It's not like you can pretend that, I didn't know that my candidate was going to oversee a military that does this. It had been doing it your whole life. And when you grew up, you voted for it. You supported it. You supported it with words. You had stickers. You waved flags. You voted. You supported them with your words. How can you pretend to not be culpable? Now, the voluntarist has a pretty easy response, which is I didn't support it. I didn't vote for it. I didn't advocate it. I railed against it. I condemned it. And then the judge says, yeah, but you still did certain things where you were taxed, whether it was you were taxed on your income or you were taxed on the money you spent by way of a sales tax, or taxed in a gazillion other ways, excise taxes all over the place that, like most people don't even know exist. So you still funded it. And the voluntarist says, yeah, but I had no way to avoid that. Like, I tried to avoid that, but at some point I have to, like, me being the victim of extortion doesn't mean I approve of it or condone it or directly participated in it. How am I the perpetrator when I'm the victim of extortion? So the voluntarist may argue that. Now, whether you think that's a good argument or not, that's fine. Now let's move over to all the people who right now, as I'm speaking to you, are not voluntarists. How do you plead to that judge? If you voted Democrat or you voted Republican, you knew you were trying to put people in power that you knew would continue the U.S. military doing what it does. And what it does also involves killing lots of innocent people around the world. Now, if you said, well, I didn't know they do that, okay, well, that will bring up the issue of willful ignorance. Like, how hard did you pretend that you didn't know that when you voted? It's like asking the people of Germany who supported the Nazis, you really didn't know what was going on? Maybe they didn't all the way know what was going on. Did they probably know that there was a bunch of authoritarian coercion going on? It's kind of hard to imagine they didn't, even if they didn't know how bad it was. So, back to you, the person who's not the voluntarist, the person who believes in politics and government of today, being on trial in 100 years. How do you justify the fact that you helped to empower people who murdered innocent women and children and elderly folks and all that? How do you justify that? Well, that's the system we had. Just like the slave owner would say. Well, it was legal. That's how our system worked. Just like the slave owner would say. Well, I mean, everybody does that. That's what everybody did. That was just societally accepted. Just like the slave owner would say. Okay, what are you going to say to your victims? A bunch of maimed or dead people on the other side of the world. I mean, saying something to dead people isn't very useful. What would you say to their ghosts about why it was okay for you to do that? Because everybody else was? Because you think the other choice was even worse? How do you think the judge from the future should judge what you advocate right now, what you've voted for? If you're Democrat or Republican or almost anything else, how would you justify that? Because right now you can hide behind the fact that almost everybody around you assumes that political authority is necessary and even unavoidable and legitimate. You accept that assumption of authoritarian aggression, controlling lots of things, and robbing everybody by way of taxes and spending it on all sorts of things, including military action. Is that good enough? Well, that's just what was going on, and that's what everybody supported. Is that a good enough excuse for the slave owner from a couple hundred years ago? Probably not. I'm guessing you would say, that's not really a good excuse, Mr. Slave Owner, for how you treated other human beings. Okay, if that's the principle, why is it a valid excuse for what you're voting for right now? Well, lots of people were doing it, and it was the law, and it was authority, and that's the system we had. Okay. If there comes a time when society no longer has the insane anti-human notion that there is such a thing as political authority, and that somehow certain people have the right to commit widespread violent extortion and aggression and murder, and they look back on you to judge you, how would you, if they had a chance to talk to you, how would you justify it? How would you explain it to them? What would your excuses sound like? And in what way would your excuses, in principle, be any different from the excuses of the slave owner? Well, I didn't want it to be that bad, and I didn't know things were being that bad, and okay, none of that matters. The principle involved is you supported something you knew would result in innocent people being victims of aggression. In fact, in the modern trial, let's set aside the issue of you supported warmongers. You voted for people who you knew were going to tax your neighbors, meaning demand money from your neighbors. And if your neighbors don't pay up, we're going to steal their bank accounts, we're going to steal their houses, we might even put them in a cage. You know that the Democrats do that. You know that the Republicans do that. You know that the people you vote for will cage your neighbors if they don't pay tribute to the ruling class. That's how taxes work, and you know it. So in the future, if you're ever on trial and somebody says, why did you keep supporting something that you knew not even just was doing something overseas that the military maybe or maybe wasn't doing bad stuff that you had no way to know about? You directly and personally supported the forced robbery of everyone you know by way of taxation. And if they were caged or they had their house stolen for not paying property taxes, or if they were put in a cage for not paying income taxes, or if they were robbed a little bit extra for trying to avoid this or that tax, and you voted for the people that you knew were going to do that to anybody who didn't pay tribute. And if you vote Democrat or you vote Republican, you knew that was going to happen. You know what happens to people who don't pay tribute to the ruling class. I mean, don't pay their fair share. You supported that. You voted for that. So what is your defense going to be if in the future somebody says, how can you do that to your neighbors? Not even just supporting some vague thing where you don't really know what's going on the other side of the world. You knew. You voted for people you knew were going to do this to your neighbors and your children and your family and your friends. You empowered them to demand money from all those people and do nasty things to anybody who didn't pay up. And you voted for the machine that did that. You voted people in power knowing full well, Democrat, Republican, I don't care, knowing full well that they would do that to your family and friends and neighbors. How do you explain that? How do you try to justify that? Well, I'm the guy from 100 years in the future who's come back to ask you, how the hell do you justify that? Because everybody's doing it? Because that's the system we have? Because it's legal? Because the alternative was even worse? Let me know in this happy little thought experiment. Let me know if this wasn't how society was, and you weren't surrounded by a bunch of other people who believed in the divine right of politicians, how the hell you would try to justify what you're doing right now to somebody who's to a society that has outgrown the insanity of authoritarianism. How would you try to make them believe that you really and truly thought you were doing the right thing by enriching and empowering people who you knew were going to forcibly rob everybody you know? How would you justify that? Good luck.